Just want to welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Scruggs, and I'm the Education Coordinator at the Northern California Land Trust, and so excited to have you here today for the second workshop in our Environmental Justice and Practice series focused on the outdoor environment. And also have my colleague Diana Sachs, who's here today, who's our Sustainability Coordinator. And NCLT, for those who don't know, since we have folks from different parts of the country and then also Canada, which is great, is a community land trust that's mostly focused on affordable housing and co-stewarding the land and housing with residents. So providing control for residents and then permanently affordable housing in the community for the long term. And the idea for this workshop series actually came out of conversations that we've been having with residents of NCLT as they consider energy efficiency upgrades, what they want to see, how those changes will impact them, and why they should care about this in the midst of other competing issues in their lives. And then also newer residents have started to think about their outdoor environment more now that they're part of the land trust, and they actually can think about working with us to do something with the land that they have, or digging up the concrete that they have and doing something with it. So this workshop series was inspired by those conversations. And before we begin, next slide, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. And I'm going to put in the chat, especially since we have folks from other parts of the country, other parts of California, a website that folks can visit if you don't know whose tribal land you are residing on today. So here in the East Bay, we're residing on unceded, stolen Chochenye Ohlone land. And we want to also recognize the indigenous Ohlone people that are here today, and that are working and present to facilitate the return of indigenous land to indigenous people through various practices, and then also healing and transforming legacies of violence and doing the work that their ancestors and future generations have called them to do. So specifically want to lift up the Segorite Land Trust. We actually have a partnership with them connected to one of our projects in Oakland, where we rematriated the land, a garden that's there, the Remay Garden, that they are taking care of now. So I encourage folks that are in the East Bay, if you don't know about Segorite, you can do more than just acknowledge that you're on their land. If you're in a place where you can actually give, you can look at paying reparations through contributing to a voluntary land tax. And for those that are from other parts of California and other parts of the country, again, really encourage folks to research if you don't know whose land you're on, and then also connect with indigenous efforts that are happening around land where you live. Next slide. So we are coming up towards the end of our fall series. A little bit more about the Community Co-Ownership Initiative. It actually began out of a partnership with the People of Color Sustainable Housing Network, focusing on providing technical assistance and resources and support for Black, Indigenous, people of color, and low-income housing projects, collective housing projects. And this is, the second part of the series that we've been doing on environmental justice and practice. And we've got one more workshop that's coming up that's focused on wellness and mental health. This has been a really tough year, I know, for me and for a lot of residents that are connected to the Land Trust. And so we wanted to partner with a really dynamic group here in the East Bay, Peers, that actually has a program focused on wellness recovery and for folks that are dealing with mental health issues, but just, wellness issues in general. So we invite folks to join us on December 4th. We did this workshop last year and it was really, really helpful for folks. And so we encourage folks to join us again. And with that, I would like to pass it off to our wonderful experts and partners from Stop Waste, Compost Gal, Pollinate Farms, Lori, Yolanda, and Trevor, thank you so much for being with us today. We're really, really grateful to have you here and lead us through this exciting conversation about what we can do with the land that we have access to. Thank you, and I'll pass it off.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I also want to extend appreciation to Diana as well. All three of us will introduce ourselves. My name is Trevor Probert. I work with Stop Waste. Stop Waste is a public agency that serves Alameda County. We're local government, and we have a role in helping residents, businesses, and the cities in Alameda County reduce waste. So we've had a long relationship with Compost, and so we've provided gardening, outreach, education, and resources for years and years and years. So talking about compost and healthy landscapes and gardens is one of our favorite things. So really happy to be here, and I'll pass it over to Lori.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Lori Caldwell. I am of course, a Stop Waste educator. I've been teaching classes with Stop Waste since 2007. And I have my own business where I teach classes, sustainable gardening classes all over the Bay Area, maintaining people's yards with the use of compost and some of the practices that we're going to be talking about today. So thank you so much for having me. I pass it on to Yolanda.
Oh, Yolanda, you've got to unmute.
So, okay, there we go. Hi, everyone. I'm Yolanda Burrell. I am the owner of Pollinate Farm and Garden Supply, which is an online farm and garden supplier for all kinds of tools around gardening and farming. I also operate Pollinate Farm, which is an urban farm in the East Bay at a couple of sites. I sell at the Temescal Freedom Farmers Market on Saturdays, normally, and through CSA program. So in past iterations of the business, I've also educated folks throughout the Bay Area around providing food and mainly growing food. I also do landscape and edible landscape kitchen garden projects. I'll pass it on to Trevor.
Thanks, Yolanda. And I want to acknowledge Lori and I have done educational work together for a long, long time. And this is our first time getting to work with Yolanda. So we've just had a lot of fun, and it's been really nice working together. So this is what today is going to look like. We'd asked Sarah to send out a little survey about topics that folks would be interested in covering. So that's how we developed the agenda. We'll start with just an acknowledgement of how equity, housing, and the outdoor environment can kind of co-interplay, and some of the challenges or barriers that folks might be facing, and also acknowledge the challenge that climate change poses to the outdoor environment, which will hopefully inform us on a couple of opportunities that we have too. And then we'll do an assessment and see what folks here want to learn. You know, we can talk about what we have set up today, but if you have questions, you know, we're a small group today. To me, that's a benefit. That means that we can have more of a conversation. If you are coming today with questions that you want to get answered, let's follow those questions. I think that would be really valuable. The first part, we'll be looking at soil health and watering. That will look like talking a little bit about soil health and specifically what that looks like in urban landscapes. We'll talk about the value of using compost and mulch as organic amendments to really supporting healthy soil. And if you have healthy soil, healthy plants, and everything else follows with it. And since we're in a drought, we'll be talking about some watering techniques that are really valuable. We don't want to not water our landscapes. Water is a vital part of the outdoor environment, but during a drought, we have considerations to make. And then we'll do a breakout Q&A. You know, we're a pretty small group, so we can maybe think about what the right size of our breakouts would be, but that would be the time for you to really ask personal questions that you're hoping to dive into. And then the second part, we'll talk more about container gardening, worm composting, which is a really valuable method that anybody can do no matter what your living situation is. And then we'll talk about less or no non-toxic pesticides and strategies to deal with pests in an outdoor environment. And then we'll have another breakout Q&A And at the very end, we'll share resources, both online and community resources that you can visit in person to support you as you are continuing your journey and you're managing your own outdoor landscape. And so I was trying to think of a way for us to acknowledge there is a relationship between our housing situations and the opportunities that we have in our outdoor environment. So I encourage everyone to just imagine 2 different housing situations in your community and their outdoor spaces. And maybe what we can do is in the chat, I would love it for folks to just type in the chat what they're imagining or what they're noticing as they imagine these 2 different housing situations. And we'll just take a minute for folks to write in the chat what they're thinking. I'm imagining, what might be the difference between a single family home versus someone who's living in an apartment or a multifamily complex versus someone who's living in a co-housing situation. I encourage you to keep thinking. We want to acknowledge that everyone here, we all have a different range of access to landscapes. If you're in a single family home, you might have a backyard or a front yard. I live in an apartment and I have a porch that's concrete. I don't have access to soil, but I still have a porch with some sunny space. You might be in a co-housing situation where you and other folks or other families get to divide a space, or you get to work together in a space. There's also different access to, or different ownership and creative control of the outdoors. At my apartment, there is a strip of unused dead grass, but I don't have the creative control over that space, even though it's kind of just a waste of space right now. There's nothing growing there. So there's also that to consider. Folks have a very, a range of resources and expenses that they can apply to gardening and landscaping. Hopefully today we're going to provide folks some very creative ideas on how you can garden or landscape in a very low cost, using low cost methods, using a lot of reuse as a main strategy. And then the other thing we want to acknowledge is that everyone's different housing situations provide an unequal experience to the impacts of climate change. And the outdoor environment is often a buffer between how we experience climate change. So I also want to give folks the opportunity in the chat to explain how you may have experienced climate change recently. And I know out here in California, we've been experiencing the drought. We had a really warm, hot summer. We just had our atmospheric downpour recently that flooded some streets. So I want folks to maybe put in the chat, how have you experienced climate change recently? Climate change is a function of, as we are emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere through burning fossil fuels or changing or altering the landscape, these greenhouse gases go into the atmosphere and they essentially reabsorb and trap solar energy. And so we are experiencing a whole range of impacts because of that process through, more extreme heat in the summers. Here in California, we are no stranger to wildfires and the impact that that's had on landscapes, as well as air quality. That air quality and increased air pollution. When we get rain, it's coming in more severe storms. And so we're experiencing heavier rainfall, and our landscapes and urban environments aren't necessarily designed to help deal with that increased rainfall. We're dealing with an extended drought right now. And even though we had this recent rain, it's kind of a drop in the bucket. In the long term, we might experience, availability shortages or differences for food and produce. And of course, all of this compounds to add to just the challenges for mental health. And so what we are hoping to talk about today is just how the outdoor environment and how we manage our landscapes, whether it's a container garden on a front porch or a yard or front or backyard, that these can help provide us with some tools to help manage our personal the way we experience these impacts of climate change, but also help kind of solve the challenge that climate change is. A couple of these challenges that we should acknowledge is the urban heat island effect, for one. We all, for folks in the East Bay, we live in a very urban environment, and the urban heat island effect is if we live in neighborhoods with much more concrete, much more buildings, and a lot less green space like plants and trees, we experience warmer temperatures during the hot summer months. And that's because as the sun shines down on our urban environment, concrete and buildings absorb and reflect that heat. And so what this graph is showing here is that if you live in an area with a lot more concrete or buildings, that just a few miles away in a residential neighborhood with a lot more trees and landscapes, the temperature difference can be quite drastic. And so as climate change continues, we need to be aware of that difference. And if we are in a situation where we can help revitalize our urban ecosystem or our urban forest by planting some plants in a garden, or even planting in a container garden, we can have an impact on this in reducing this urban heat island effect. As far as prolonged drought goes, I wanted to just acknowledge that this recent rain, the way we can think about the drought that we're experiencing in California, the metaphor that we've been using is, let's say that you have a debt of $20,000. This recent rain that we got, which was very extreme, and we received 3 or 4 inches of rain, it's kind of like reducing that $20,000 debt by like $2,000. We're still in a drought. We're still in a situation where we can expect water shortages and those things. And so that has an impact on how we water and manage our landscapes. We should just keep that into consideration. But it doesn't mean that we can't have an outdoor landscape. It doesn't mean that we can't water our plants. We just have to do so in a way that is thoughtful. And then the last thing that I'll mention is just with flooding, with the atmospheric, with the heavy rain that we got in California, folks that are living in communities with a lot more impermeable surfaces, so concrete, streets, asphalt, water doesn't have a place to sink into the soil where it belongs. It runs off the surface of those impermeable surfaces, clogs storm drains, and then causes flooding. If we can protect our homes and our neighborhoods by revitalizing the soils in our outdoor environment. Soils are meant to absorb and drain this moisture and provide benefits to the ecosystem. And if we have unhealthy soils in our landscapes, or compacted soils or concrete, this water doesn't have a place to go and be a benefit to the landscape. So what we'll be talking about today are, building healthy soil and managing our outdoor environment will help prevent issues of flooding, especially in protecting our neighborhoods and our homes. And to kind of wrap it up, climate change, as we had mentioned, is a process where we're emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And it's caused us to have a very bad perception of carbon dioxide and carbon in general. Carbon just gets a bad rap. And what I hope folks can understand by the end of today is carbon, while it's in the atmosphere and it causes climate change, carbon is the backbone of life. When carbon is in soils, it is actually feeding a healthy ecosystem of plants, plant roots, fungi, bacteria, and invertebrates. And we can return carbon, we can draw down carbon out of the atmosphere and return it to soils where it's a benefit through managing our landscapes in a healthy way, our outdoor environment. So by gardening, if you're a new gardener and this is something that you're just starting, know that there is so many co-benefits to managing in your outdoor landscape at any scale. So hopefully folks will walk away with plenty of skills and questions answered today. And just encourage folks to look at these images and think about all the co-benefits of having a landscape, benefits to yourself, benefits to the ecosystem that you live in. You know, even if we're living in an urban area, we are still part of an urban ecosystem and forest. And, you know, the picture in the bottom there, I live in an apartment. There's one tree outside my apartment, but every year a pair of mourning doves comes and nests in that tree. So when we think about our scaling, you know, just because if we live in an apartment and we might consider ourselves to have less access to an outdoor environment, just planting a couple plants in the container garden can have a huge impact. So we don't want to discount the opportunities that we have, no matter what our living situations are. So I hope that's encouraging, and I encourage folks to think about their own situations as we go forward.
All right. Thank you, Trevor. Also wanted to make a point too, as far as when you were talking about the water runoff and the soil's ability to hold on to the water, but also the soil's ability to filter anything out of the water. I mean, we haven't had rain in a long time, and a lot of toxic chemicals have just been kind of sitting on top of that hardscape. And once it rains, it just kind of takes its way and ends up going into our waterways. So also by building healthy soil, we're also going to be able to increase the soil's ability to filter out a fair amount of that waste before it actually gets to a water source. So our main question, of course, is what do you want to learn today? When you first signed up for this workshop, what were some of the questions that you had about what your interests were and what you would like to learn? So I'm just encouraging everybody to kind of put their questions in the chat, and then we will circle back at the end of the webinar, and hopefully we'll have had opportunity to answer all your questions. So I just want everyone just to take a quick minute and kind of put down any kind of probing questions. All questions are good questions. So please feel free to enter them into the chat right now before we get started with our main agenda.
And since we're a small group, maybe you can unmute yourself too. And I'm actually going to write these questions down in the slideshow itself.
Oh, right on. Oh, wow. Great questions so far, everyone. Right on.
So I'm just writing what I see in the chat. So folks are interested in the, let's see here. Relationship between environment and population, how we can water in a drought. We'll absolutely cover that. Learning about sustainable front and backyard and native plants. How we can maximize the space of a small balcony for container gardening. It's a great question.
Definitely be covering that for sure.
Ooh, how to clear weeds and plant a garden. We can talk about that. Tips for gardens in all seasons. Ideas on how to keep a garden alive year-round. I'm a slow typer, so I'll come back and I'll retype these in, and we'll just use the chat. So I'm going to.
Yeah, mine is very similar, exactly what Chrissy has said, just how to keep it alive for all seasons.
Nice. Well, fortunately, we're you know, if you're coming to us from California, we have the advantage of being able to grow all year round, of course. But I'm assuming some of our friends from Canada don't necessarily have that as an option. But there are a lot of options, even when there is snow. So.
And we'll begin by starting with healthy soil and water. And so a lot of questions might get answered in this. And when we go into our breakouts, I encourage folks to ask these questions, and we'll have a time to go through. So anyway, I'm going to pass things off to Yolanda.
Great. Okay, let's see. So next to sunlight, soil is the most important element that you can have to promote growing healthy plants. Soil serves a purpose of providing nutrients as well as anchoring the plant. It helps to deliver nutrients and water to the plant. But there's different kinds of soil. You need healthy soil that's filled with water. It has a high water holding capacity, as well as lots of organic matter and beneficial microbes to help to feed the soil. So just think of it, instead of feeding your plant, you're going to feed your soil, and then everything else will follow along properly. In the soil, we've got different kinds of nutrients, mainly NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And in that helps the soil grow, helps the plant grow. Nitrogen is used by the plants to promote leaf growth and its green color. And of course, the green leaves help the plant photosynthesize and make its own food. The phosphorus is used in the plants to form healthy roots, and the roots are used to pull up the water as well as the nutrients. Phosphorus also helps to make seeds and fruit and flowers. And this is whether you have edible plants, the food that you eat, or ornamental plants. Potassium helps with the overall health of the plant. Helps strong stems and strong cell walls, and it helps provide, just helps to guard against pest and disease for the plant. Okay. Let's see, what else? We want to also make sure that it has a good pH in the soil. pH is the level of acidity or alkalinity in the soil. And generally we want it in the middle range. The pH scale goes from 0 to 14. We want our soil to be in the range of 6.5 or so, or 6.3 to 6.8. You also want to make sure your soil has crumbly texture. Some of us are blessed with clay soil, rock hard clay soil that you could actually, make vessels out of. A lot of us, like in Alameda, has very, very sandy soil. And you want kind of a balance between the two of sand, of the three: sand, silt, and clay. All of those three kinds of elements will help your soil to hold more water, hold more nutrients, and support the plant. The soil particles are held together in a sort of web-like fabric. You don't want your soil to be too dense or too thin. A clay soil will definitely hold lots of nutrients, but since it also holds a lot of water, your plants can't get to it. So you want to make sure you have a very balanced soil full of nutrients. There's also biology in the soil, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. Go ahead. Thank you. So soil is a living thing. It requires air as well as beneficial critters, I like to call them. This is the soil food web. I don't know if you've seen this chart, but basically it's an illustration of how everything that we eat somehow ends up in the soil or comes from the soil. It's basically a food chain. We have what's called trophic levels. The first trophic level includes the photosynthesizers that are plants, and they get their energy from the sun. Once those plants break down, organisms eat the photosynthesizers, and those make up the second trophic level. The third trophic level eat those organisms that are on the second level, and so on and so on. And you get your vertebrates, and they will poop and that will get broken down, and then that is taken up by the plants and the cycle starts all over again. So having a good amount of organic matter in your soil is very, very important. And also lots of bacteria. So how do you know what is in your soil if you want to grow healthy plants either in the ground or in containers? The best way to do it would be to do a soil test. Next slide. So a real simple way to know what the texture of your soil is to do a jar test. And there are lots of resources online that give you the specific instructions on how to do this. But basically, you're going to dig down deep in your soil to get all the levels, probably 6 to 8 inches, and put it in a jar, put your soil in a jar with a couple of drops of dishwashing liquid and water. You'll shake it up for a few minutes, and what happens is that each of these elements separate themselves. So you can see in the photo on the right, on the left, you see sand will come out first, then silt in the middle, and then clay, and then at the top it's water. So over a 12 to 24-hour period, you'll be able to measure the percentage of sand, silt, and clay in your soil, and that will give you an idea of the texture that you have in your soil. But this won't tell you what kind of nutrients are in the soil. So somebody asked how much soil is used for the soil test. For the jar test, probably I would say a 1/4 cup to 1/2 cup. Normally these are performed in quart jars, and that way you can mark on the side with a Sharpie and measure the percentage of sand, silt, and clay. Another way is to get a scientific lab test. So you can actually take samples through your, all over your yard and get an aggregate test. There are a couple of places that will do soil tests for you. Well, there's a lot. The one that's local here is A&L Western Labs, and they're in Modesto. Also, I've sent people to University of Massachusetts at Amherst. They both use machines to do the testing. So it's real efficient. You get your soil test back in about 7 to 10 days, depending on the time of year. The A&L test is running right now about $17. And the other one at UMass is running about $20. But as you can see here, you get a lot of information. You'll get your pH on the side. It'll tell you what your pH of your soil is. If you get the graphic representation of your soil test, it'll tell you, generally speaking, whether you're low, medium, high, or very high in all of these different elements that are measured in your soil. And I don't know if they test for hydrocarbons. It's probably a special test, just like lead is sometimes a special test. But they'll talk to you, tell you the organic matter, what you have in it, you know, percentage of organic matter. The more organic matter, as opposed to mineral matter in your soil, it helps to keep your soil moist, helps it to retain water. So you usually want at least a 5% organic matter in your soil. I'm working with this right now. I took soil samples. I think I took like 7 soil samples in the spaces that I'm farming. And it's all over the board. So now I have to go back, look at their recommendations, which is the bottom part in the comments, and figure out how to treat my soil, what amendments to add to my soil to bring it up to the specific quality to grow the crops that I want to grow. So this example is just for almonds, so it's an almond orchard, but I'm growing vegetables. I'm also growing flowers, so those needs are going to be slightly different, but the soil test will give you a recommendation on what to do and how to do it. And Also, you might have, you see in the red zone, things are very, very high. So usually the best thing to do is to do nothing for that, depending on what the element is. As you plant, those nutrients are going to be taken up by the plant and will reduce the amount that's in the soil. So you might not have to add amendments for a season or two. Okay, so the next slide. Another way to improve your soil is sheet mulching. And sheet mulching is basically, I like to explain it as composting in place. You're basically going to take your native soil that you have, and you're going to add cardboard, water, and lots of organic matter. Probably in this case, it's in the way of compost, and then some kind of a mulch on top. So on the photo on the right, it's a farm that urban farm that I'm working on, and it was just weed whacked. It was in the spring of last year. And so we marked out the beds that we were going to use. So we knew exactly where the beds were and where the walking areas were. And we collected lots of cardboard. Big pieces are great. I like to get them from bicycle shops or appliance stores to have large sheets of cardboard. Lay it out, water it so it starts the breakdown process, and then you're just going to apply the compost right on top and just let it sit. Some people like to tarp over it. I like to, especially in the wintertime, I'd like to have the rain hit it. And in a couple of weeks, you will be able to get down to your soil level. You'll see worms, you'll see all roly-polies, all kinds of microbes. And I'm in the process of doing that now, and it's a lot of fun. On the left side, we had to terrace the area a little bit because it was on a hillside, but basically we're doing the same thing. And sheet mulching is a great way to improve your soil. So another way to do it is to cover crop. Cover crop, somebody asked about, who was that? Was that Jenny? I just saw something that came up in the chat. You can unmute yourself if you'd like to ask that question.
About, I just wondered if there's printing pictures, you know, decoration on the cardboard, whether that means that can't be used.
I like to use brown cardboard. Any kind of, if it's black ink, it's most likely soy ink, and that's going to be fine. But any slick cardboard is going to have some kind of a plastic coating on it, and you don't want to use that because that's going to end up in your soil and it's going to contaminate your soil. So, you know, shoot for the regular cardboard, the brown stuff, not the fancy stuff, not the white stuff.
Thanks.
Okay.
And I wanted to add, someone had asked a question that they had mentioned that they got a house of land in the back and they wanted to clear the weeds and plant a garden. Sheet mulching is the perfect technique for preparing that land. As Yolanda said, you can weed whack the weeds. When you lay the cardboard on top of the downed weeds, the cardboard will smother those weeds and they will decompose and add nitrogen to the soil. Grass and other weeds, they're green, they typically have a lot of nitrogen. So as they decompose, they build the nutrition in the soil. And then the cardboard, as that breaks down, it adds carbon. And carbon, we know we talk about NPK, but carbon is also really important. It's kind of like a nutrient, but it's just more of an important element in the soil. So sheet mulching, and we have a ton of resources on sheet mulching that we'll share at the very end. So if you're interested in this, we can point you in the right direction to get you started.
Yeah. Thanks, Trevor. I love sheet mulching for the purposes of removing weeds, although I still haven't found the magic bullet for oxalis. It just takes a lot of time. That and bindweed are really, really persistent. But, you know, as long as there's cardboard, I will do it every year and it works great. Another way to improve soils is to cover crop. A cover crop, the difference in a cover crop and in farming, a cash crop, The cash crop is the thing you're going to eat or you're going to sell. The cover crop is a crop that you grow for the purposes of improving your soil. One of the rules that I love to follow in gardening is that I never want to leave my soil uncovered. So if I've pulled something out, if I've pulled tomatoes out, then I'm going to cover it with something else. I'm going to cover it with another crop, follow immediately with another crop, or follow with something that will invigorate my soil in preparation for the next cash crop. So the photo on the left is a cool season mix, and I use that a lot. It's the same, the photo on the left becomes the photo on the right. So in the cool season mix, it's got legumes, vetch, peas, winter peas, bell beans. It also has grains in it. So it'll have like a barley and a wheat in there. And it's just all mixed together. You scatter it on the area. You can pull a little bit of the soil back. You really don't want to till your soil too much. So just pull maybe an inch of soil back, scatter the seeds, cover the seeds, and this is the perfect time to start cover cropping in preparation for the spring growing season, because we have free water in the way of rain. So you cover your soil over your seeds, wait for rain, or hopefully your soil is already moist enough. It will sprout and it'll look like the photo on the right. So you'll see all of the grains. There's a couple of flowers in there, but mostly peas. When about 30 to 50% of that has started to flower, we terminate the cover crop by weed whacking. You can use shears if you want. It just depends on the type of space that you have. We have 3 large beds here. And so we're just going to cover crop it. It's called chop it and drop it. Chop it up, leave it on the ground. It will decompose. It will become organic matter. And then all of those, all that activity in the soil food web will react to that soil as the cover crop is breaking down. So you'll see worms, you'll see roly-polies, all kinds of real good biological life in your soil. And so it's building it as you go. Next.
Also, I want to add that this technique, it's useful in bare soil. It's useful if you have a raised bed.
Yes.
You can even grow cover crops in a container. You know, I grow tomatoes in pots on my front porch, and when the tomatoes are done, I plant like a pea or a type of bean in that pot next, so that that plant is returning nutrition, so that I can plant tomatoes again next year.
Yep. And then, of course, it's the big one, compost. It's great to improve the soil. It will help remediate lots of deficiencies in the soil. And it's just a real great way to stop waste. You want to put green waste from your yard as well as kitchen waste. You know, you chop up you're making a salad and you've got some funky leaves. Any of that kind of green waste that would go in your green bin can go into your compost. So if you have the space, you can make your own compost, or you can purchase compost. And I think later Trevor's going to talk about compost sites where you can pick up compost. The bottom photo is just a 2-bin system. And I use actually a 3-bin system where you can actually collect all of your yard clippings as well as your kitchen scraps and layer it and get it really nice and hot. So you see my thermometer here. It's got pretty hot. You want it to get hot so that it kills weed seeds as well as microbes that aren't beneficial to your soil. And the one at the top left is compost that I got from Trevor's organization. So Yeah, I use it all the time. And then with every season, you're going to add a little bit of compost to the soil, a couple of inches.
I wanted to interject that if you are interested in doing composting right now, with it being fall, now is a great time to go out and collect leaves, which is an excellent feedstock for compost. If you can take them and store them, hopefully dry, in certain places, I utilize usually broken garbage cans, or sometimes I'll put them in bags. But the nice thing about it is to build a pile using that feedstock, as well as having that feedstock on hand for during the spring and summer months, when you're going to be adding a lot of, if you are adding food scraps, a lot of wet, fresh things, you can utilize these leaves that you've kind of banked from the fall to kind of help maintain decomposition, even decomposition in your compost pile throughout the spring and summer when those dried leaves are not available.
Yeah. Hey, Trevor, have you seen Gibbons Street in Alameda?
No, I haven't.
Oh, you got to go there. It's one of those streets that is so full of leaves, just because the trees line the streets, and then the residents just rake them in a pile, and they're in the parking areas. And I crave it. Every time I drive down that street, I just want to take a bag and just gather people's leaves, because I think that they just dump them. They don't do anything. That's great.
To do it, I collect leaves all the time. I have a can that's on wheels. So I used to have 3 large trees in my front yard that supplied me with enough leaves that I had, but they got chopped down. So I usually go anywhere and collect it, or I collect it from my clients' yards. And so it's a great way to, utilize it. That people don't seem to realize what a resource they actually do have. And then there's something to be said for allowing a fair amount of leaves to remain on your property and remain at the base of your plants, because there's a lot of research that indicates there are a lot of insects and a lot of things that lay their eggs in these leaves. It provides habitat for birds, for bugs, for lizards, for a variety of different integral habitat species that we have here in the Bay Area. So there's something to be said for leaving some leaves as they are. Eventually they will break down and they will build healthy soil without you really having to do anything at all.
Yep. Great. Thanks, Lori. Thanks, Trevor.
And as folks might notice, we're talking about the benefits of having insects and bugs in your garden or in your landscape. And that might be a change for some folks. Some folks might, see bugs and they immediately think they're a pest, or they're swarming, or they need to be dealt with. 99% of the insects that you see outside are beneficial to your outdoor environment, outdoor landscape. So reconsider your relationship with bugs and insects as you go on. We're going to talk more about mulch.
Jenny, even earwigs.
We're going to talk more about compost and mulch, just because of how important it is for outdoor landscapes. And, Yolanda had showed a couple examples of how to make your own compost. You can engage with composting in a ton of different ways, and we'll be explaining that, if you have a yard space, you can make your own compost. If you don't have a yard space, if you're in an apartment, there are other ways to compost that make sense for your space considerations. Before we go there, though, I encourage people to look at this picture of soil. And I'm hoping folks can unmute themselves and just say what they notice about the soil out loud so that everyone can hear.
It's very moist.
Mm-hmm.
There's some nodules in there.
Holds together.
Yes, it's definitely holding together. Keep going. What else?
It's very dark.
Well, there's some nodules in there too. I don't know whether it's gravel or could be organic matter.
Mm-hmm.
I personally think that this is black lava soil, and it is like formed by a volcano, stuff like that. I think so.
Mm-hmm. So what everyone's noticing, Yolanda had shared when you can send your soil to a lab and you can learn a ton about your soil. She mentioned the jar test. You can learn about your soil type. There's also a ton of other observations you can make about your soil just by looking at it. And so, you know, folks notice the color. The color can tell you how much organic matter is in your soil. Usually the darker your color, the more organic matter. And so the darker, the better typically. Seeing all these roots and how firm the soil is holding together, that shows that the soil has really good structure. If the soil was crumbling apart and falling apart in this person's hand, we might think that it doesn't have the greatest structure. You can just see that it's moist. You know, the organic matter and structure helps give it a larger water holding capacity. So the healthier your soil, usually the less you have to water your plants, because that soil holds on to moisture for longer. So, you know, if you're a novice gardener or you don't know a lot about your soil, I really encourage you to go out, dig some up, put it in your hand, give it a smell. It should smell like a forest floor. Take a look at its color, its structure, and you can get a sense of what your soil is like and maybe what your soil needs. And soil is made of a couple of different things. You know, it has pockets and space for air and water. The most of it is made out of particles, broken down particles of rock, so minerals, and a very small percentage of it is organic matter. Yolanda had said earlier, you know, a good target to aim for is 5% organic matter in your soil. And if you have clay, you know, clay can feel really tough to deal with. It could have really poor drainage, but it also has a ton of other benefits. It's full of nutrients usually. And when you have a lot of organic matter in your clay soil, it helps that soil break apart a little bit. It helps it breathe, it helps it drain, and it gives space for plant roots to grow deep into that soil. If you have really sandy soil, like I have in Alameda, usually it's a little poorer in nutrition. It can be very loose, but organic matter, when it's added to sandy soil, it can help lock up those sandy particles and give it more structure and give it a better water holding capacity. And when we talk about organic matter, one of the easiest ways that we can add organic matter to soil is through compost. And so here's an awesome picture of Lori. You know, if you're not composting at home, everyone in Alameda County especially does have access to the process of composting through their green bins. And so you can get compost through commercial composters, and they receive material to compost through our green bins. And so if you have a green bin at home and you're not using it, I really encourage you to consider how you can, you know, separate your waste at home and put your food scraps or yard trimmings and put them into the green bin, because it's a really important source of compost for gardeners around the county. You can also imagine if you put things like metal or plastics into the green bin, those materials end up in the compost that we need to use. And so that is problematic. So if for folks who weren't sure about the value of sorting waste into their green cart, I hope that can encourage you to reduce waste in your household. But aside from the green cart, if you have a landscape or a garden, when you're putting food scraps or yard trimmings into the green cart, you are kind of waving goodbye to a really valuable resource that you can use on site through either a backyard compost bin, which is on the left there. But if you don't have a yard space, if you're in an apartment, something like a worm bin is also really valuable and more compact way to make and use compost. Compost is, the way I think of compost is, it is not soil. It looks like soil in these photos, but it is not soil. Soil has that mix of mineral, it's mostly mineral and a little bit of organic matter. Compost is pretty much pure decomposed organic matter. And so you can't just grow plants straight in compost. The value of compost is when you add it to soil, the improvements that it gives to soil are where you get the benefits. These pictures here on the left, the left-hand side, that's a compost that was made in someone's backyard bin, in that kind of black biostack that we had a picture of beforehand. The compost that you make yourself is always the best compost. the picture in the very middle, that's a commercial compost that was made from the materials that people in Alameda County put into their green bins. So this type of compost is largely what's going to the farms that are growing our food. It's going out to the Central Valley. It's even available for folks home gardeners to get access to. And then the photo on the right, that's a really special type of compost. That's worm castings that's made in a worm bin or worm composting system. Worm castings are different than regular compost. It's more like, it's closer to a fertilizer. It has a lot more nutrients, and you have to use it a little bit differently. The real value of worm castings is that it's so easy to make. And I live in an apartment. I don't have space for a big compost bin in my space, but I do grow plants in containers. I have some indoor plants as well, and I can compost my food scraps in a worm bin, which is, we'll go more into that later. And I can use these castings in my indoor and my outdoor container plants. I wanted to mention, what compost provides in organic matter to soils. It provides some nutrition, but really organic matter is it's the food source for all the beneficial fungi, bacteria, and invertebrates in soils, even in containers. And it allows that process of those bacteria and fungi to do nutrient recycling in the soil. So I think of it as like a very, very slow release fertilizer. It takes time for bacteria and invertebrates to break down the nutrients that are in compost, and it provides it to plants slowly and as needed. It also helps soils increase their water holding capacity, so really important during a drought. And it also improves the soil texture and the soil structure. And it's just really easy to use compost as well.
Real quick, I'm sorry, Trevor, real quick. I know Yolanda had talked about the concept of NPK. And so when we're talking about our basic compost, that picture that you had there on the left, the NPK of basic compost is the 1-to-1-to-1. So it's very equal. So it's not going to provide one more nutrient more than another, as opposed to worm castings, which are definitely a lot more higher in things like nitrogen. So like you said, the basic compost is going to be more of like a soil amendment, while worm castings are going to be definitely more like a fertilizer, and should be used accordingly like that. And I'm sure you'll probably talk about that when we talk about worm composting.
Yeah, we have a ton of resources on how to make regular compost. Today, we will be talking more about worm composting. So we'll share those resources. Using compost, we always recommend top or side dressing. That is a technique where you apply the compost to the top of the soil. We don't usually recommend digging it in or tilling it into the soil. Yolanda had mentioned, minimizing tilling. When you till or disturb soil, even, sometimes with really compacted soils, there might be a circumstance where you need to till. But for the most part, it can be destructive to the soil structure if we are digging up and tilling soil. So applying it to the top of the soil, either around plants, just side dressing, or if you have a blank slate of bare soil, that would be top dressing. Recommend with regular compost about 2 inches, 1 to 2 inches. And then with worm castings, we'll talk more about applying worm castings if you want to use them a little bit more sparingly. When you water your soil, the compost slowly works into your soil, so it won't remain on top for long. After you water the soil, the compost will work its way in with the help of invertebrates. Compost, if you live in Alameda County, there's a really cool project that is beginning soon. And, especially if you're a home gardener, you can get compost, commercial compost in bulk deliveries. Sometimes you can also get bagged compost, but there are a couple community organizations in Alameda County who, in a partnership with Stop Waste, will be opening what they're calling Compost Hubs. And these are places where residents from Alameda County can come and just pick up compost for free. It's a free resource for folks. You bring your own bag or bucket. and you pick up compost from the farm, it's a great way to get to know the folks at the farm. The farm themselves are an amazing resource for providing education and resources on gardening at home. They're just awesome community spaces. So Farm to Market in Alameda will be opening in the next month or so, whereas City Slicker Farms and Castlemont Farm in Oakland will be opening in the springtime. So we'll be sharing, it's a partnership with Stopways. So as they open, we'll share that information with Sarah and Diana, and they can share that with all you. And we'll have some information on our website about how folks can access free compost. And then compost's best friend is mulch. And when I say mulch, I'm specifically referring to wood chips or arbor mulch, which are tree trimmings. And mulch is applied as a soil cover that goes on top of compost. It is always on top, and you never dig in mulch. The benefits of mulch, it helps retain moisture in your soil. It helps reduce the temperature, or it helps maintain or balance the temperature of soil. And it also provides habitat for a whole bunch of invertebrates and fungi in the soil that are really important to the soil ecosystem. Mulch is something that you can also come across for free. The picture on the right shows a bulk delivery of mulch on someone's driveway. If you have a smaller landscape, this is probably way too much mulch for yourself. What we've seen folks do is they get neighbors together where they have like a mulch party, and they get a single free delivery. This is a delivery that came from a tree trimming service for free. That's the best stuff. And if you get your whole neighborhood involved in taking from this pile, it means that you don't have to be responsible for putting all that on a small landscape. So sharing with neighbors is the best way to get access to that. If you don't have relationships with your neighbors where this might not be an option, you can find mulch at landscape vendors. And Ginny mentioned in the chat, the transfer station at Waste Management also has access to compost, and they also have access to mulch as well.
If you're looking for usually smaller amounts of mulch, if anytime I'm looking for free mulch, I'm going to contact probably a smaller organization. Like I'm going to stay away from maybe a Davy Tree Service, where you could be expected to get anywhere from 10 to 20 cubic yards. If you go with a local kind of small mom and pop kind of situation, you can expect to get anywhere from, usually the trucks usually hold anywhere from 5 to sometimes up to 10 cubic yards. And usually I find that that's a little bit more of a more comfortable size of mulch that you can utilize.
And I should add, the compost hubs often have, the farms that I mentioned as compost hubs, they also often get these free deliveries of mulch. And so if you go there for free compost, I'm sure they're willing to share the mulch with you as well. Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Yolanda to talk about watering during a drought.
There we go. Where does the water come from? If you think about it in a large perspective, we talk about what's called the water cycle. And so you can see this image of how water is cycled throughout the land and the mountains and the bodies of water. You have evaporation, where the heat of the sun causes the water on Earth in oceans and lakes to evaporate and turn into liquid gas. And it rises up into the sky, creates clouds, and all this water vapor creates clouds. Then there's condensation. As the water vapor in the clouds cool down, it becomes water again, and it's called condensation. Then there's precipitation. And we know that that's rain. Water falls from the sky in the form of rain, snow, sleet, and hail, and hits the ground. Sometimes it hits the water, the bodies of water, but in either way, it's collected. The oceans and the lakes and the rivers collect the water. Water will also hit the ground. It will, if your soil is not hard, it will recharge the water, recharge the groundwater, and then that water is then goes back into the bodies of water, and the whole cycle starts all over again. So in our drought situation, we have not had a lot of precipitation. And so now that we've got a little bit of rain happening, I like to collect the water and use it for gardening. So how do we save water? Go ahead. There's different ways to conserve water. You can, of course, use less water, limit your showers, limit your baths, or don't fill up your bathtub as much. Don't use a lot of water when, use a dishwasher if you have one, instead of doing it by hand. Use low water toilets, all the different ways that we all know about to conserve water. So that uses less water, but we also want to capture the water when it does rain. So on the right, you see a simple rain barrel system where it's going to rain and come off of the roof, goes into the gutters, down the downspout, and into some kind of collection situation. You also want to keep some kind of a filter on that to keep any of the debris that's come off the roof. You can imagine after a year of drought that that first rain is going to be pretty dirty. So you want to make sure that you're collecting and filtering your water as you're collecting it. During this particular atmospheric river, I was really prepared for it. And I had buckets, I had 5-gallon buckets all over everywhere just to collect that water. They filled up, and I think, Trevor, you said we got 4 inches. I ended up getting, I have a rain gauge, and I ended up getting 8 inches of rain this last storm, which was really great. So, every kind of bin and bucket that we had, we collected that water and then we used it. The idea is to slow the water, sink the water, and spread the water. You want to keep it, like Lori said, keep that fast runoff from taking all kinds of toxins and contaminants directly back into the bodies of water that we use for drinking. So you want to slow it down so that it will infiltrate the soil. The soil and the ground actually acts as a filter. So this is a photo of a rain garden or a bioswale. A bioswale is basically a ditch that is planted with plants that is used to collect water during a rain, and it slows the water from going into our wastewater stream and also waters plants. So slowing the water down, sinking the water so that it's filtered, and spreading the water around before it goes back into the bodies of water is a great way to conserve it. Next slide, please. So watering alternatives during a drought. I know it's very, very satisfying to hand water, but it's not recommended. Try to avoid doing that. This is me and my son from many years ago when we had raised beds in our yard. And one of the things that I really loved to do is to hand water. It's great because you can actually, gives you an opportunity to check the plants while you're doing it. However, you end up kind of zoning out and using much more water than is necessary. One of the alternatives, or one of the solutions, if you do want to hand water, is to get a little gauge. There are cheap gauges that you can buy, and they fit on the hose, and it actually counts the gallons as the water is passing through. And it really gives you an idea of how much water you're using when you're irrigating by hand. I specifically like drip irrigation. You use a timer or a controller, or you can use gray water or laundry to landscape. We'll talk briefly about each of these. The next watering alternative is drip irrigation. It's very, very efficient. It delivers the water directly to the roots of the plants and reduces splashing up onto the foliage of the water. Sometimes if you've got contaminants or different kinds of disease that your plant might be susceptible to, it's transferred by water splashing from the soil right up onto the leaves, and it can cause pests. So drip irrigation is a great way to prevent that, because it's basically a tube of some sort. You can use 1/2-inch emitter lines, or you can use the one on the right is like a weeper hose. It's got lots of micro holes in it. The one in the raised bed, in the vegetable bed, is it has emitters in the lines, the tubing, and it's on a timer. So you're just going to get the amount of water that you need. And Jenny's asking, how do you feel about soaker hoses? I feel that, if you're on a budget, they are okay. They just tend to break down over time. To keep your hoses from breaking down, I would put mulch on top of it. There's a lot of debate about drip irrigation because they're made of plastic. Most of the systems is made of plastic, and you want to generally speaking, use less plastic in your life wherever. This is what we have right now. So drip irrigation is on a timer. If the next slide, I think. Yeah, so you can use a hose end timer. And it will go from your hose. This particular one uses a splitter. So you have a Y. One side goes directly to the drip irrigation system. The other side uses the hose. So you can use the hose for, whatever you're using the hose for. Hopefully not washing sidewalks and driveways. And you can time your watering. You typically want to, if you're using a drip irrigation system, you want to water early in the morning so that water has an opportunity to evaporate off of the leaves in case you get some water on the leaves. Any kind of moisture on the leaves you want to eliminate. And if you do it early in the morning, then usually the sun will help that water evaporate. There are different kinds of systems. There are kinds that will use a battery, so you can just set the timers. You can set the duration, the days of the week, and the amount of time that it's watering. The more advanced ones have access to rain stations or weather stations, so they will actually turn themselves off and postpone watering if rain is in the forecast. There are some that use Bluetooth, so you can control them from your phone. And then there's the real basic ones that are like an egg timer, where you can just turn it and crank it to the number of minutes that you want to use it, and then the water will just kind of shut off. But I caution you on those, because the water, the egg timer doesn't really hold the water back for very long, and it will cause leaks. So, but there's different kinds of timers. When you do use drip irrigation, you want to make sure that you're not using it on brand new soil that hasn't been irrigated at all. You want to saturate your soil first and then turn on the drip irrigation according to schedule. Otherwise, that water that you're using in the drip system is not going to do any good, because the soil tends to be what's called hydrophobic. It does not absorb the water readily. So you have to soak it first and then start using the drip irrigation system. Next.
Compost can be
go
a
ahead.
big help. I was going to add, if your soil is hydrophobic, you can tell, you'll see water running off and not absorbing. Compost can really help
Yes,
if you apply it to
definitely.
begin with.
Also, I'd like to make that with drip irrigation, you're going to need to install a pressure regulator to bring
Yes.
down the pounds per square inch. Usually, if you were to allow for your normal pressure to pass through drip irrigation, then you could definitely blow it out. So you're looking at 25 to 30 pounds per square inch for that. And also really quickly, I don't use drip irrigation in mine. I am a big hand waterer, but I use that in conjunction with the moisture meter in my container garden. I go through my garden, check out and see what needs to be watered and what doesn't need to be watered, or how much it needs to be watered. And then I go in after that fact and then use a hand watering situation for that.
A really great resource in the Bay Area for if you're new to drip irrigation is the Urban Farmer Store.
Yeah.
Urban Farmer Store sells a whole bunch of things, but they sell irrigation equipment, and the folks that are there are all about providing education to the community about watering. So they can help you figure out, if you're new to drip irrigation, they can help you figure out what you need based on your garden situation.
Okay, and then the next is watering with other things, with gray water mainly. You know what? I'm about to lose power in my computer. Can I get like 2 minutes? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Hang on. Go ahead and chat. I'll be right back.
Maybe we can answer some questions. So Ginny asked where the Urban Farmer Store is. The Urban Farmer Store that I know of is in Richmond. Is that right, Lori?
Yes, Richmond, Mill Valley, and San Francisco. If you're also in the East Bay, there's a Ewing as well. They also provide drip irrigation supplies as well. Some of the questions we had here was, where is it? I saw something in the back. I use black plastic cover to kill the weeds before I planted. It's not the best thing to do. I mean, it's plastic. So I kind of liken it to pretty much just putting a plastic bag over your head. What the usual outcomes for that is really kind of choke everything out. And so the nice thing about using cardboard versus that, it is permeable. I've seen between black plastic or landscape cloth, I've seen a lot of really, really great soil on top of those kind of things, and just hard packed clay, because nothing's allowed to permeate down through it. You need to be able to have compost and organic material and water permeate down through it in order to have it. So cardboard is going to be your best way to go. And then of course, since it's plastic, it's made from petroleum. And then as it starts to break down, it breaks down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. You definitely don't want to incorporate that into your garden for sure.
Any other questions about soil and water before I continue? Okay, so another watering alternative is using gray water. Gray water is water that's been used for another purpose. I use gray water quite a bit where I live. I will use pasta water outside on my trees. I will use rice water if I'm washing my rice. That has a lot of nutrients in it. Other ways to do it is to, if you have space in your showers, to put a bucket in your shower. And as you're warming up your water before you get in the shower, just use that cold water in the bucket and collect it. And then later you can use it to water your plants, whether you have them in, in the ground or in containers. There are systems, gray water systems in homes where you can actually redo your piping so that you can collect shower water, and it will either go into kind of a collection unit, and then from there to your garden, or just go straight out. I have one of those where it uses a valve, and depending on, you know, what kind of products you're using, if you're using a plant safe product, then you can turn the valve so it goes straight, the water goes straight to your garden. Or if you need something that might be more toxic to the plants, then you can turn it back so that the water goes to the sewer. So lots of ways, especially in the kitchen. If you're using a mild dishwashing soap, and you wash your dishes by hand in a tub, you can use that rinse water to water your plants. So we just take the tub right out, and we have a tree right outside the door, and that tree always gets watered that way. So the next slide, is a laundry to landscape system. It's a little bit more advanced system, but it is legal in Alameda County now to use laundry to landscape. Check your municipality for regulations as to whether or not you need a permit to do it. But basically what you're doing is using your laundry machine as a pump. And the pump will, as you're washing your clothes, the water, instead of going directly to the sewer, it goes in a pipe, and it gets filtered underground. Gets piped underground, and it's actually deposited in what's called a mulch bed. And so you see underneath those trees, there's the pipe just ends. There's mulch under there. It's usually just wood mulch. And what that does is filters the water. It filters the water, and then the roots take up the water, and you're able to water your orchards and you know, deep-rooted plants that way. And again, as with using any other kind of gray water system, you want to make sure that you're using cleaning products that work with those kinds of systems, because you don't want to build up salts in your soils. And the laundry to landscape system also has a valve, so that you have the option of going to the landscape or going to the sewer, depending on what, you know, if you're going to use a lot of bleach or whatever, you don't want that in your garden. But it's a real efficient way to reuse water.
And I want to share a local resource. There's a group very active in Alameda County called Dig Cooperative. And Dig Cooperative, they are experts on this laundry to landscape system. And if you just Google them or look them up on YouTube, they've done so many, you know, webinars and provided videos. They sometimes even provide designs for folks who are trying to figure these things out themselves. So, and they're local. So definitely check out Dig Cooperative if you're looking for more information about the laundry to landscape piece. And gray water action. Yeah, definitely. Okay. So I'm looking at the clock, and it's 12. I know we are going until 1 o'clock today, so I think we're a little behind our schedule. So maybe if I can recommend we do breakouts for maybe 5 minutes or so, just to give us time for the second half of our thing. But I'll hand it over to Sarah if you can set us up in breakout groups. And I'll just reiterate, the point of the breakout groups is for folks to ask their questions and for us to think more about these topics, but specific to everyone else's situation.
Yeah, and since we are a smaller group, should I do 2 breakout groups? Yeah, okay.
Sure, yeah,
Thank
that
you.
sounds great.
I have to go. It's been very informative, but I have, thank you very much for everything.
Thank you, Patricia. Okay. I think people got scared by the breakout groups.
We can continue, folks. If you know, since we're a small group, if folks just want to announce their questions as we go, we can do it that way too. We don't have to do
I think that's what we're gonna do.
Okay, not
All
a
right.
problem. This is recorded. We can yeah, so I just encourage folks to ask their questions as we go. Okay. And let's see, let's move on. Okay, so the second part of this, we're going to talk about container gardening. So it looks like we lost Yolanda. Add her back in.
She's coming back in.
Yeah. So, for folks who maybe have smaller spaces or concrete patios, container gardening is an awesome alternative. I'll be talking about worm composting, and then we'll talk about less toxic or non-toxic pest management. So I'm going to hand things off to Lori.
All right, can you go back to that one first picture? Sorry. You go back to the, all right, cool. This is actually a picture of my garden from last spring. I live in a situation where I'm a renter. The bulk of actually all of my yard is paved over, as you can probably see in the pictures. I have taken some liberties to kind of create some raised beds in the back using some bricks, but other than that, the bulk of my garden is in containers, including perennials. I have 3 fruit trees and 2 blueberry bushes. I just added just this year, and so it's totally easy to do container gardening. There's just a few little extra things that you need to take into consideration, but you can be very successful. I saw a quick question come over the chat about doing tomato plants, 5 gallons or larger. Actually, 5 gallons seems to be the kind of minimum for certain things, especially for bigger plants. If you're looking for things for like herbs, you can use smaller containers, something like a 1 gallon. And then of course, there's still the great opportunity to do reuse in your garden. All right, next slide. Thanks, Trevor. All right, so container, raised bed, vertical gardening, all can be done very successfully in your landscape, whether it be a yard or a patio or any kind of situation you may have. I actually also had a friend who at one time or another, she lived in an apartment with no balcony, and she was able to utilize her sunniest window using curtains and drapes to cover and kind of create kind of a greenhouse situation. She was able to grow tomatoes in her bedroom, actually. So you can do a variety of different things for sure. A couple of examples I have here are some reuse elements. On the left, my little gnome, a pot that I used to take compost out with. The metal eventually kind of broke through, and so it wouldn't really hold anything. But that's an instant drain hole, so I was able to incorporate things like succulents into it. As you can see, the container I have on the right is a wooden container, and then I've really kind of filled it with a fair amount of crops. So don't be afraid to incorporate several things into your bed in order to do it. The few things about container gardening are the fact that sometimes you'll have to water them a little bit more often than you normally would in ground, just for the fact that the plants don't have access to any kind of underground water, of course. Also, the fact that you'll have to amend, add some more fertilizer on a consistent basis than you normally would, just for the fact that the nutrition in the container is just limited to what is actually in the container. So I find myself generally utilize mostly a lot of worm castings as part of my container garden, especially while everything is nice and green. But once things kind of get to a flowering and fruiting situation, I usually pull back the nitrogen. I'll pull back on things like worm castings or fish emulsion, stuff like that, and switch that up for something more in something that's a little bit more heavy in the phosphorus vein. Now, if you have issues or if you are vegan or vegetarian, because there's a fair amount of different soil amendments that you can buy that are animal based, bone meal, blood meal. But there are definite alternatives to that. Vegan mixes, alfalfa meal, stuff like that, if you don't want to use any animal products. And they all work very, very well. I saw a question coming into the chat. For growing to, oh, she said that one. What crops do you think like to be planted together? Usually it all depends. There's a concept of companion planting. Certain things really work really well together. Some of our most famous companion planting things are the Three Sisters, which unfortunately, that's corn, beans, and squash. So unfortunately, corn is actually one of the crops that you cannot be successful for in planting in containers. But I think you could actually just grow anything else, asparagus, fruit trees. Usually if I'm doing a fruit tree, I'm gonna go with the dwarf variety, but things like tomatoes and basil work really well together. I plant things like onions and kind of leafy vegetables together. Carrots and tomatoes work really, really well together as well. Especially kind of at the transition season where the tomatoes are starting to kind of die back and the soil's still warm enough for carrot seeds to germinate. So as the tomatoes die back, on the carrots, which of course occupy more underground soil as opposed to tomatoes that grow up top, then as they kind of fade away, it opens up to a little bit more sunlight for carrots to kind of do well and thrive as well. A couple of other elements of reuse I used to work for a catering company. And if you ever go to a catered event, they usually have what's known as a beverage temp keep, which is, you know, you can put coffee or hot water in it. We had a couple of broken ones. So it comes with its automatic drain hole. So I've incorporated succulents into one of them. And then the other one currently holds basil right now, which is still actually doing a great job and growing for sure. So as long as it has a drain hole, as long as it's food safe, you can utilize that. For things like succulents or any kind of ornamentals, you could really run the gamut because of course you're not going to be ingesting that. So things like shoes, or old shoes, or even things like cinder blocks, bricks, all kinds of different stuff that normally would not be appropriate to put edible foods in, you could utilize for your ornamentals or for your native plants or anything that's going to attract pollinators and beneficial insects as well. Next slide. All right. So different types of containers we talked about, 5-gallon buckets. You can utilize those. Usually plastic, usually kind of white or light colored plastic has a tendency to break a little bit quicker than maybe black plastic containers would, but they're still really good options. You just put drain holes on the bottom of it. I've used things like Rubbermaid toters that have cracks in the bottoms of it to plant things like beets or chard. Coffee cans and plastic and metal work really, really well. Burlap, you could pretty much only get really like one season out of burlap, but usually that's sometimes it comes your way for free. That's how I ended up getting it. That's how I ended up finding out that you can only use pretty much one season for it. Plastic is going to hold water a lot longer than say something like terracotta, unless it's glazed terracotta. A glazed terracotta container will definitely hold a lot more water than the unglazed variety would be. And then it really all depends on the size. Again, if you're looking for something like herbs, you could go anywhere very small, 1 gallon. But if you're looking for something that's going to require kind of like a deep rooted type of plant, 5 gallon is really a good way to go. Also too, yeah.
I like to use wine boxes and drill holes in the wine boxes. They get discarded all the time and they're wood and they will last a few seasons. You can get the shallow ones that are great for lettuce and the deeper ones for deeper rooted crops or flowers. And they're pretty.
Yeah, definitely wood is, wood is definitely what should be and can be an option. Most of mine are not necessarily reused. I purchased them But yeah, but wood ones have a tendency to hold on a little bit water a little bit longer, for sure. Absolutely. Your next slide, please. Again, at one time I had utilized the ground. I have sandy soil in my yard here in Martinez, and so there was a time where I had pulled up some of those pavers away from the fence and utilized bricks to kind of create my own little raised bed that I filled with soil and of course compost. And then I decided that I was just going to go straight to containers for sure. But take all that into consideration. I've seen raised beds done with bricks, with all kinds of cement tubes. I've seen it done with wine bottles as well, just inserted into soil, rocks, sticks. I've even seen raised beds made out of, which is not necessarily a reuse element, but you can get them if you've ever seen them on the side of the freeway. There's wattles, those large, it look kind of like sausages, but they're filled with straw. I've seen those just created in a circle, filled with soil and added and use that and especially if it's something kind of temporary, you can use that on top of the soil or on top of things like concrete or asphalt as well. On the right, we had a cooler that bit the dust, and now it is holding all of my bulbs. So my narcissuses are starting to come up, and I will continue to add to that. And it's just kind of nice and definitely out of the way. Again, it comes with its own drain hole, so that works out very nice when it comes to gardening for sure. Next slide. This one is for untreated palettes, and I would love to really reiterate the concept of the untreated palette. There are palettes all over the place. Untreated palettes will be marked with the HT, which means they've been heat treated, and you can do a variety of different things with them. They can be created to make vertical gardens. They can be dismantled to make planter boxes. They can be dismantled to make raised beds if you're going to be planting in ground. I like to include this one because even if you're trying to do kind of vertical gardening with a pallet, you're going to want to start off and allow the plants and the soil to settle in a horizontal mode before you push it up to make it vertical. You want that soil to kind of necessarily compact itself, but kind of arrange itself in a way so when you do tip it forward to create yourself a vertical garden, that it's actually going to stay in place for sure. And yeah, again, we want to do heat treated. Yeah, it's great for lettuce. For strawberries, again, you can dismantle it and make very shallow kind of containers stacked on top of that as well. So yeah, untreated pallets are great. And then depending on kind of what your sun and shade situation is, you can actually hang them and put them actually where the sun actually goes. That's the nice thing about vertical gardening, is you can definitely chase the sun for sure if you need to.
I've also seen with this untreated pallet situation is before planting, after you've filled it with soil, and obviously it's usually going to have a bottom, is to layer burlap on top of the soil so that it helps when you tip it up to make a vertical garden. It helps, it's a little bit added protection to keep the soil from running off. And I've seen folks plant like succulents into these, and the succulent root systems can be really dense. So over years, like the succulent roots will completely kind of weld themselves to the pallet, so there's no risk of losing soil. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty locked into there. But yeah, I mean, you can always find it, and then look at things like Nextdoor or Craigslist or FreeCycle. There's a lot of, groups that, depending on your area, where there's a lot of trading that happens. Also, too, when it comes to kind of like black plastic containers, check your local nurseries. if you know like a landscaper or a landscape architect, generally they usually end up taking a lot of those things back from future projects that they've done, and you don't really have the option. They have no, way of disposing them, and reuse is going to be a great option for that. Anytime you're going to pull in a new container, especially if it's had a plant in it, I'm always going to recommend that you kind of give that a really good wipe down, or give it a good cleaning before you incorporate it, because you never know if the plant that was originally in there had died of some sort of disease or something. You definitely don't want to pass that along to any new plant that you're going to be incorporating, for sure. I am not a big fan of bleach, so I'm just going to go kind of either old school, kind of hot soapy water. I like to use things like vinegar or hydrogen peroxide to kill certain things. But if you do use bleach, then of course you don't have to use a lot of it. I mean, a little bit goes a long ways for sure, but making sure that you try to rinse, if you do use bleach, make sure you try to rinse it as well as you possibly can. Again, you don't want to try to incorporate that into your garden, of course. And then when you.
Sorry, Lori. Another really great resource for getting reuse materials like untreated pallets or pots. In Alameda County, there's the Creative Reuse Depot, which is in Oakland on Shattuck or near Shattuck. And that place, what is there is constantly changing. So you kind of show up and see what they have and get lucky. Another place is Urban Ore in Berkeley. And Urban Ore is always a great place to go. And, they have everything from reuse pots to fish tanks to all these things.
Bathtubs
if you have the space for it. And everything's priced very, very inexpensive for the purpose of reuse. So those are two amazing resources for folks who are looking for reuse containers.
Right on, thank you. All right, you got another slide for me? All right, a little vertical gardening. I utilized 2 large coffee cans to grow nasturtiums last year, just as a fun experiment. And I definitely want to encourage, especially if you are, even if you're not new to gardening, try to experiment with something at least once a season, maybe a new plant or a new technique, because you never know what might work and what might not. So vertical gardening is going to be a great option. You can do things with 5-gallon buckets. I do, however, recommend, if you are going to be doing something with vertical gardening, that anything that you have that may have a plastic handle, I might either want to try to reinforce that with metal or replace that with metal, just for the fact that it's just going to have a lot more longevity as metal, as opposed to a plastic handle just being able to hold on to the weight of the soil plus the plant. And then you can grow things out of the bottom of containers, hang things off of fences, things off of buildings, and just find a way to kind of definitely chase the sun if you have to. Also some reuse elements. The one here on the right is I think it used to be a screen. It had either fabric or some sort of rice paper on it. And I've used those in a variety of different ways in my garden, mostly as trellises. For those who don't have, they have a fair amount of gaps. I've utilized a 1/4-inch hardware. They call it cloth, but it's actually wire, to cover that, to kind of at least get them started. And then they can kind of work their way up that stuff. I'm sorry, was a question in the chat?
Yeah, Ginny is asking about, so a tomato sauce can that seemed to have a coppery coating. Can you talk a little bit about metal and maybe different metal coatings that some of these containers might contain if there are issues?
I have not come across that, to be honest. I'm assuming it's some sort of non-reactive, especially with tomato sauce, just for the acidity of it. I could not, to be honest, I could not say. I'm going to have to defer to my colleagues on that one. That may be the option if, when in doubt, that may be something that may work well with, and maybe an ornamental kind of plant. So yeah, I mean, it has to be food safe. So if you're still able to eat something out of it, but I'm not really sure if it's going to be what the actual kind of safety would be for that. So sorry, I wish I had a better answer for you for that.
For folks who are growing vegetables, are there particular containers that you would prioritize and then some containers that you would maybe avoid just in case?
Oh, yeah. I mean, definitely. There's been a whole kind of debate whether or not you could use cinder blocks just for the idea of fly ash. I've seen a lot of people make raised beds out of it. There's been, and I've done my own little research on that, and I keep finding kind of mixed signals around that. So I'm always going to want to err on the side of caution. If it's plastic, then I'm definitely going to want to go with something that's food grade. So if it's something that food has come in, you know, like a coffee or, you know, yogurt or something like that, I'd say that you're definitely safe to go. But as far as the copper, that I'm not so sure. I'm not sure if it's going to end up being some sort of reactive to the soil that you put in it or any kind of amendments that you might put into it. So again, I would definitely err on the side of caution. And then of course, wood, untreated wood is definitely going to be a better option as well. All right. So the soil for container garden, and one of the great benefits about container gardening is you generally don't have to worry about whether your soil is sandy or clay, because you're going to be utilizing kind of potting soil in your garden. And I know that's kind of an outward cost, but the nice thing about it is you don't have to toss it unless it's something kind of a really bad disease has come your way. I use my soil over and over again, and I just amend it every year with compost to increase its water holding capabilities. And then I will side dress with a variety of different soil amendments depending on what's growing and what kind of stage is it in. Is it flowering, fruiting, or is it just plain leaves? So when it comes to potting soil, I'm going to buy a potting soil that I recognize the contents on it. So the ingredients, so the ones that I usually buy have kelp meal or worm castings or compost, something that I can recognize. When it usually gets to the point where there's a lot of chemicals in it, where any of the ingredients end in ATE or OUS, I'm definitely going to want to avoid that, because those are usually petrochemically based. They have a tendency to kind of push the nutrition in and force your plants to grow a lot faster than they normally would. I'm just going to say Miracle Grow, so I'm just going to throw Miracle Grow under the bus. Miracle Grow does everything that it says it's going to do. And I mean, they don't lie. However, it grows things in a much, much faster rate. And when you're using things like compost or even worm casting, which is still technically kind of like a fertilizer, those nutrients are kind of slow release. So I always use the analogy of, imagine you're going from the age of 2 to the age you are now in 2 to 3 weeks time. And imagine what kind of stress that is on your body. Miracle Grow is that type of thing where you're growing up way too fast. A stressed out plant is going to attract a fair amount of pests to your garden, because it's that wounded antelope on the Serengeti. And now here come the hyenas, here come the lions, and they're going to come in and definitely want to try to attack that, as opposed to something that's a little bit more natural. That's just like, I ate an apple and I had some kale, and it's going to release its nutrients into my body slower, and it's going to warrant more of a natural growth as opposed to a more speedier growth over time. So potting soil, of course, is going to be key. It has some drainage elements in it. It's definitely going to be lighter. About what's VH1? I do have an opinion about fish emulsion. I love fish emulsion. It stinks to high heaven though. They say it's for indoor and outdoor use. I would not use it for indoors. For my indoor plants, I use strictly just worm castings. fish emulsion smells, and it even smells when you use it outside, but it does actually work great. I'm not sure what VH1 is. Can anybody speak to VH1 other than the
I've
TV show?
seen it before. It comes in a blue bottle, and I think it's a chemical-based fertilizer.
Okay, then no.
Yeah,
Then no to VH1.
yeah. I'll
The
look it up.
the TV station and the chemical for sure. So but yeah, that works really, really great. High in nitrogen, fish emulsion is, but it also has a fair amount of phosphorus for flower and fruit development. But no, it definitely works great. And I mean, it's basically just ground up fish. So, and again, if that's not your jam as far as animal products, worm castings work really, really well in order to incorporate that into your garden as well. So when you are filling the containers, you definitely want to make sure that you're going to leave a little bit of a lip, at least 1 inch of a lip around the top of it, just for the fact that just going to make it a lot easier for you to utilize, to work in it, you know, to add a soil amendments. Also too, if you're planting by seeds, sometimes what happens when you water them, especially if you hand water them, sometimes the seeds jump off and then they're not in the container. Now they're in your surrounding area where you don't want them to be, for sure. Container soil is going to take a minute to kind of get adjusted to its new situation. So when I'm starting a new pot, I'm always going to want to put something on the bottom. In the past, I put rocks and stuff like that. But over the years, I've really switched out. As you can see in the picture, that I'm utilizing coffee filters. Used coffee filters or brand new coffee filters. Again, it's still going to allow for drainage, but it's going to keep the soil in place, because the soil, when you first put it in a container, is really fluffy and light. And when you first water it, its first inclination is to just go straight out of that drain hole. So by kind of blocking the drain hole to keep the soil in place, but also to allow for drainage, and of course, because it is natural, eventually, as your soil kind of, I would say compacts, but settles into its new home, of course, that coffee filter is going to decompose, and then it's just going to leave, you know, the drain hole just open, as it were, if you never put it in there before. So I'm going to mix potting soil with my with compost before I do, usually about 1/3 compost to 2/3 potting soil. I'm going to mix that in there. I'm going to go ahead and put it on top. That's the only time I'm going to utilize that. So as I use my containers from season to season, once the plants are removed from it, I'm going to top dress with compost, which is another great reason why you want to leave that 1 inch lip. I'm going to definitely put some fresh compost on top. And then when I water it, again, like Trevor said, it's going to percolate down in through the soil. There we go.
Oh, those are pretty.
Yeah, tree collards are great. Dwarf fruit trees, they come in a variety of different types. Just with the fact that they're only really going to get about 6 to 10, maybe 6 to 10 feet tall. You're going to want to make a bigger container. I've started with my lemon and my lime tree in a 5-gallon. They graduated to a 10-gallon. And then now they are somewhere in the, I never even really measured it. I would say it's probably somewhere in the 20 kind of gallon range. They're in wooden containers now to kind of just to incorporate their root balls. You want to make sure that there's plenty of room. I just transferred a lemon tree for a client. I'd been sitting in a container for 6 to 7 years. And when I pulled it out, there were more roots than actual soil. So that's how you can always kind of tell that your plant started to get root bound. When you go to water it, if the water just percolates down, even if you are using compost, then you have to understand that there might be something else at play. And chances are it's probably root bound. I pulled that thing out, loosened up the roots, and we actually transplanted it into the ground. So all kinds of perennial plants, blackberries, blueberries, artichokes, strawberries, tree collards, of course, dwarf fruit trees, and then any kind of annual pretty much, except for, like I said, the exception of corn. Corn, I have never been able to do successfully in a container. Oh, can you go back? I'm sorry. On the right is my Rancor lime tree. It's a mandarin lime cross, very juicy. That's why it looks like it's orange, because it's a mandarin and a lime cross. That works great. This is when it was just in it's in a 10-gallon container when it first got transplanted. If you have issues with space, the one on the left might be a great option for you. It is a Meyer lemon tree, but it's espaliered as opposed to kind of like a circular kind of form. Espalier allows you to kind of put these plants like up against a fence or up against a wall as they kind of lay flat up against those kind of areas. And then you could do a variety of different plants with that. So espalier is a great kind of space saving but you're still able to kind of get some good plants. And then take a look around when it comes to espalier plants. They come in a variety of different forms. If you have the option, if you are putting things in containers, again, I'm going to encourage try to do some sort of dwarf. You still have to keep them trained. Their initial want is to kind of create that circular form, but you're going to have to kind of prune it so it can still remain kind of prostrate along a wall or along a fence, that type of thing. Some people like to kind of tie them back as they start to kind of grow out and to attach them to the fence. But depending on if you can find dwarf varieties, you can find varieties that not necessarily with citrus, but usually things like, you could find things like a cherry or a plum if it does come in a dwarf form. You also have the option of the having a plant with multiple types of plums or multiple types of genetically familiar plants. So say I found a plum tree that I could espalier, but on top of it, there's a different variety of plums. Or it is or I could do maybe a pluot or an aprum, which is still genetically similar because they all are a member of the plum family. So you can kind of maximize the space you have without committing to more and more and more trees, pretty much. All right, next slide, please. All right. Most annual veggies, of course, except for corn, which is unfortunate because I do love corn. Herbs, of course, culinary, medicinal plants as well. And think of a lot of our culinary herbs actually have a lot of medicinal properties as well. So it's a great little twofer. Edible flowers. And then again, I also plant native plants in pots. I have some yarrow that's going really great right now. This is year 2 of it. I managed to, even though it is drought tolerant and is in a container, I still managed to kind of plant it on a mound to kind of increase the drainage on that. And so if you don't have a lot of space for these things, they're still important to incorporate any kind of native or any kind of pollinator plant or any kind of plant that's going to attract beneficial insects. Because again, if you're growing food, you definitely want to incorporate those things for, of course, for pollination and for kind of built-in pest control when it comes to that. And then I'll definitely be talking about that in the next few slides.
Okay, so thank you, Lori. And Lori talked a lot about how in container gardening, the nutrition in the soil is so important since you're limited to what soil is in the container. And so worm composting is a really excellent option for folks, whether you have a yard or a front or backyard, or if you are in an apartment. Worm composting is super compact and it's very space saving. So these are pictures of my compost systems. On the left, I live in an apartment, but there's a little space on the left where I used to have a regular compost bin. You can see kind of how much space it takes up. And then on the chart there is how much compost I harvested from that compost bin when I when I was ready to harvest. And so that it takes up a lot of space. on the right-hand side is the worm bin that I have, and I have it situated on my front porch underneath, just a shoe rack that I have. You can see the bin itself is pretty small. It's compact, doesn't take a lot of space, and I continually feed my food scraps to that bin. And if you've never heard of worm composting or worm bin before, yes, that's literally a bin full of worms that are consuming or decomposing my food scraps and turning it into worm castings, which are a really valuable and organic fertilizer. Worm castings, like compost, is full of organic matter, but what's special about worm castings is that worms in their gut have a host of a whole bunch of unique bacteria, a little bit of fungi that are really powerful nutrient recyclers. And when you apply worm castings to the soil, all of those beneficial bacteria that were in the gut of the worm are now in your soil ecosystem. And so worm castings themselves are, whereas Lori had said earlier, compost is usually a 1-to-1-to-1. That's 1 part nitrogen, 1 part phosphorus, 1 part potassium. I think of worm castings as more of like a 4-to-2 or 4-to-1. Sometimes, depending on what your feedstocks were, it could be a little higher in nitrogen even. So it's more of a fertilizer, which means that we want to use a little bit less of it. If you apply too much, you can burn your plants. Thinking back to that normal, like an inorganic fertilizer, if you apply too much, your plants will take up too much and they'll grow too fast and it ends up burning the plant. Similar circumstances with worm castings. We want to apply it a little bit more infrequently because of their benefits. But if you are container gardening, I don't regularly fertilize my container plants except for worm castings, and it's all my plants need. Especially important if you are growing edibles, which typically edible plants like vegetables need more nutrients, more soil fertility than like a California native plant. So if you're growing veggies, worm castings are really valuable. And when you think of worms, if you have access to regular soil and you dig in your soil and you dig up an earthworm, that is not the worm that we are using for worm composting. The worm that we use is called a red wiggler. Red wiggler, their name is Eisenia fetida, and they are they're a worm that typically likes to live in the top layer of the soil, underneath leaf litter. They rapidly decompose food scraps, and they're voracious eaters. And typically, you actually can see in the picture what the red wiggler looks like. They're usually about 4 or 5 inches long, sometimes a little shorter. You can see those are worm eggs, and inside each of those worm eggs contain 3 to 4 baby worms. And in a worm bin, you're essentially trying to create an environment that is is attractive and beneficial for these worms. And so if you are finding worm eggs in your worm bin, that's a good sign. That means that your worms are happy, they're reproducing. So if you're worm composting, always keep an eye out for these worm eggs. They're not too hard to find. If you're worm composting, typically if you're getting started, in a regular sized worm bin, which I'll show you a few examples of, you normally would want to start with a pound of red wigglers. You can get those red wigglers from a worm farm near where we live in the East Bay. There's a couple of different worm farms. There's Delta Worms, which is out in East County, kind of near Livermore, Tracy. And then there's Terravesco, which is up in, I think in Yolo County, so to the north. And sometimes you can also find red wigglers at like bait and tackle shops, or you can always, if you have a friend who's doing worm compost, you can always take worms from a friend's bin. So to get started, you need to make yourself a bin, or you need to find a bin. From a reuse perspective, I always recommend folks just if you have a homemade or a plastic tote at home or a plastic container, that typically is a great place to start. In my bin, it's just a regular, plastic storage bin that I think I got it for reuse off of Craigslist. And to start, as long as you can drill holes in the side to create some airflow, you've got yourself a worm bin. That's all you really need. However, there's also other alternatives. You know, you can build yourself a wooden bin. Wooden bins, because of wood's ability to absorb moisture, wooden bins are typically do a great job of regulating moisture. So in a plastic bin like what I have, sometimes moisture can collect at the bottom. And especially if I've added a lot of food scraps, sometimes it could get a little too wet and I need to remove the moisture or excess moisture in some way. Whereas a wood bin, I feel like has the benefit of regulating the moisture because it can absorb excess moisture on its own. And then also, you know, if you can find worm bins for sale online or at, I know that the Ecology Center in Berkeley, they sell worm bins. This is called the Worm Cafe on the right. You might see this. There's a whole bunch of different varieties. The Worm Cafe is a stacked variety, and it kind of has its own different process for how to use it. Ginny asked a question, you know, what happens if you don't give them enough food? That's a good question. I'll answer that in a little bit. But we have a ton of resources on our website, which I'll show at the end. We have blueprints on how to build your own wood bin and instructions on how to make your own plastic bin using a wooden tote. When you have your bin, so this is a picture of my bin that I have at home, just a regular storage tote. To get started, you need to prepare worm bedding. Bedding is the ecosystem, or think of it as where the worms are going to live inside the bin. And typically what I use is shredded newspaper. If, you know, I think nowadays it can be much more difficult to find newspapers these days. I often will go and, you know, grab some from like old copies of the newspapers that sometimes they have little distribution out in the street, but I also will try to get some reused old newspaper from friends if they have it. If you don't have access to newspaper, things like shredded egg cartons also work, shredded cardboard works. And if you have trees with, you know, that are deciduous and with leaves, you can use leaves as well. And to begin,
what about junk mail, Trevor?
If you have junk mail, if it's glossy paper, someone asked a question earlier about about cardboard and with the inks. If it's like a black ink, typically that's going to be a soy-based ink, and that's totally okay. But if you have high glossy paper that has a sheen to it or a shine, there's typically a plastic layer involved in that, or the ink is made out of petroleum. And so if it's high gloss in color, I wouldn't use it. But if it's a no gloss and it's a black ink, I would definitely feel good using that junk mail. To start, you will shred newspaper, and you'll fill that shredded newspaper up about halfway. You want that first layer to be damp. And so sometimes people will take that shredded newspaper and kind of dunk it into a bowl of water and wring it out. I actually just fill it up halfway with shredded newspaper. Then I kind of dip my hands into a bowl of water and I kind of splash it onto the shredded newspaper, then mix it up. And you want that layer of damp shredded newspaper to be about as damp as a wrung out sponge. So you don't want it dripping wet, but you don't want it noticeably dry. And you can imagine that the normal ecosystem that red wigglers or worms live in, they like it to be damp. So that's the importance of adding that moisture to the shredded newspaper. And then on top of that layer of damp newspaper is a dry layer. You always want to have a layer of dry newspaper or bedding on top. That's to simulate sort of like the surface of the soil where worms don't necessarily want to, they don't always want to peek their head out, and normally they're trying to hide from predators or things. So the dry shredded newspaper serves as a buffer zone so that worms don't leave the bin. And also it fills up the space so that things like fruit flies that might want to get into your bin and reproduce, the dry shredded newspaper on top that fills the rest of the bin prevents things like fruit flies from getting in there and causing a nuisance. I also always add in one handful of healthy soil, and that's to inoculate the bin with a whole bunch of other beneficial organisms like bacteria that can play a role in breaking down your food scraps into compost. And if your bin is going to be always indoors, you don't necessarily need to do that. I have my bin outdoors, so I absolutely recommend throwing in the handful of soil.
Can I also make the case for if you happen to know somebody who has a worm bin, then I would ask them to take a handful, not necessarily of just their worms, but you're able to pull it up because again, it's not just a worm bin, but there's a whole other host of compost critters that are integral to making sure that the worms are actually able to ingest that food. So if you're able to grab a little bit of it, because sometimes you'll get worms and it'll just be worms, but you definitely need a lot of other compost critters to come along for that party in order to kind of shred those things down in to much smaller pieces to make it accessible for your worms as well.
And I see some questions, so, and thank you, Lori, for going through a few of them. So my recommendation, and when it comes to feeding your worms, so when I open up my worm bin, that picture on the left, I have that layer of newspaper on top, and I peel back that newspaper to reveal the layer where the worms are living. And at the very start, it's going to be a lot of newspaper with worms kind of wiggling their way through the wet newspaper. But over the course of a couple of months, and the more castings begin accumulating in the bottom of the bin, you might peel back that layer of newspaper and find, layer of worm castings. Whenever you feed your bin, and with a pound of worms, I aim for about a quart of food weekly. I take like a quart-sized yogurt container, and I use that to kind of track. That's kind of a minimum. Depending on how active your worms are, you could feed them more. It's kind of a balancing act. You want to be. I check in my bin once a week, and I kind of can get a sense if my worms can handle what I'm feeding them or not. If I'm looking in my bin after a week and the food has clearly been eaten by the worms, then I know I can feed them a little bit more. On the right is a guide on what is okay to feed worms and what is not okay. And so the things that are okay to feed them are raw kitchen food scraps. So that includes fruit and vegetable peelings, apple cores. Eggshells are great, especially if you can break them up or grind them into smaller pieces. Worms, when they are decomposing food scraps, they rely on a gullet, and they actually want to have a little bit of like many little pieces of rocks, or sometimes like really ground up eggshells that can help almost act as teeth, or like they have a grinding function in their gullet when they're consuming food scraps. So
Like a
eggshells
crop
are really,
on a chicken.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Same function.
A gizzard.
A gizzard. Yeah. Thank you. Gizzard. Coffee grounds I think are the best things for worms. You can include the coffee filters in that. Sarah had asked about coffee ground or tea bags. Tea bags are great. Even shredded paper. The things that we shouldn't apply are things like citrus, any acidic foods, salty or oily foods, and that includes if you cooked vegetables but you cook them in an oil, I wouldn't feed them the cooked vegetables. Grains, breads, green beans, meat or fish or bones. You might hear folks say that they can feed their bin meat or bones. I don't recommend it because it will stink if you open it up. But those are folks who maybe it's purely outdoors and it's not a big deal. But I don't recommend it. And then dairy products are also another thing to avoid. Troubleshooting your worm bin, for the most part, if you are feeding them the proper amount, you are feeding them foods that they prefer and avoiding foods that would offend them. And you're always making sure that you have a fresh layer of shredded newspaper on top. You should not have any issues with your worm bin. But if you do, if you find that your bin is a little smelly, typically what that means is that there's too much moisture in the bin, or there's some sort of offending food scrap like meat or dairy that is beginning to stink. The way to fix that problem would be to remove that offending food scrap, or if there's too much moisture in your bin, and you would know that there is if you can tell that there's moisture gathering at the bottom of the bin. What I do is I remove some of the wet newspaper that's in there, and I just re-add dry newspaper. And by removing the wet newspaper, you've removed some of the moisture, and keep doing that until it solves the issue. Fruit flies are typically an issue if there's unburied food scraps, or it says too wet, but also if there's some airspace in the bin. Fruit flies reproduce mid-air, so they need to have space to fly around and find another fruit fly to reproduce with. So as long as your bin is filled with dry shredded newspaper up on top, it should prevent fruit flies from happening. If you're opening your bin and food is not disappearing, the food is still there, typically means that you're feeding your worms too much. And so removing some of that food and then feeding them less will solve that issue. If you see bugs in the worm bin, that's 99% of the time, that's a great thing. We want more bugs in your worm bin. If you have your bin indoors and that is an issue for you, there are certain things that you can do. I have red spider mites listed there. Lori taught me a great tip. If you have red spider mites in your bin, a couple is not a problem, but if it's like an infestation, if you put a piece of bread, like a stale piece of bread in your bin, the spider mites will attract to that piece of bread. And then as soon as they've latched onto that bread, give it a day or two, you can remove the bread from the bin and we'll have removed the bulk of the spider mites. And the last thing is worm run. You know, sometimes this happens when you first make your worm bin. If you added a bunch of worms to a new environment and they're getting used to it, sometimes they can try to escape the bin. They'll climb up the walls and try to get out. The way to solve that issue is to shine a bright light onto the bin, and that will cause the worms to go back down into the bin. The other thing that you can do is just stick it outside on a sunny day and the sun will do that for you. Typically they're leaving the bin because there's some food scrap that they don't like, something like citrus or something of the sorts. And usually worm run will fix itself on its own by solving that issue. I see that we're getting close to 1 o'clock, so I'm going to go through this next part quick, and that is.
I'm sorry, Trevor, really quick too. Sometimes with worm run, especially since we're getting rainy season, when the barometric pressure drops, indicating that rain is about to come, it sends a signal to the worm, and the worm, not realizing that it's sitting in my living room or sitting in my backyard in my worm bin, it's going to want to run to avoid getting flooded. So sometimes when it starts to rain, you can lift the lid and you'll see worms on the top of your lid. So again, the solution is the same, to make sure that you expose them to the light.
And as you feed for me, I can make a fresh worm bin. I've added a pound of worms and I've been feeding them for maybe 4 months or so. After about 4 to 6 months, and I have a good amount of worm castings that I've accumulated at the bottom of the bin, I know it's ready for me to harvest. There's 2 different methods that I use. There is a third method. The first method, which is the easiest, is the migration method. And what that means is in your bin, you will stop feeding them for about 2 weeks. Worms will finish eating what's already in there, and then now they're looking for food. And then after 2 weeks, you add food to one side of the bin, and worms will migrate over to that side of the bin that you fed them on, leaving the castings on the other side to be free of worms, so that you can then pull out of the bin. Usually when I harvest castings, I want to let them sit for about a week or so to kind of let them settle before applying them to my plants, to my soil. The other method is on the right, which is I call it the cone method. And I remove castings from the bin and I put them on a tarp and I pile them up into these cones. And it works really well on a sunny day. Worms will kind of crawl their way down to the bottom of the pile to get away from the sunlight. And then you can just slowly harvest the castings from the top of the pile. And you can do this over and over throughout maybe like 30 minutes or so, to the point where you've harvested a bulk of the castings from the top of each pile, with leaving a little bit of castings on the bottom, with the whole host of worms that have sunk down to the bottom of each pile. The best way to use your castings, of course, you can always top dress and side dress with them. Another method that I really like to use is the dilution method. I know Lori calls this the colander method. And that's where you take a 5-gallon bucket, you put a colander, not the colander that you would cook food with, but maybe like a reuse colander, or a colander that you're not going to be using in the kitchen anymore. you put that colander on top of the 5-gallon bucket, and then you take a big handful of worm castings and you put it inside the colander, and then you take a hose or you take some water and you run it over the worm castings. And what happens is the worm castings will break apart and they'll dilute into the water. And then you want to make sure that with as much water that you have in the bucket, that the color of the water is the color of a weak tea, not too dark. Like the bucket on the right is definitely too dark. So I had mixed some of that into another bucket on the left, added water until I got it to the color that I wanted. That's about the amount of worm castings that you want diluted in the water. And then I use that bucket of water to water my plants, and then it distributes the worm castings very evenly. You can also make worm tea or compost teas. We don't have time to share about that, but there's a ton of resources online, including at our website on how to make compost tea. And
Trevor,
Gloria,
speaking of,
oh
sorry.
yeah, go
I
on.
was about to say, speaking of tea, there was a question earlier. Would you recommend use tea bags for putting in your worm bin?
Absolutely. Yep. Both the bag itself and the tea leaves within the bag are okay. Sometimes I'll yank off the tea label because sometimes there's a staple in that, and I don't want to put metal in the bin. But the tea bag, absolutely, that's perfect. Hey Lori, we have 5 minutes, and so if I can ask you to be really concise with your section
Absolutely.
on pest management, because we also have some resources to share at the end that we'll kind of zoom through.
Okay, let's do it.
All right.
All right. So let's talk about non-toxic pest control. You can be very successful to be controlling your pests without having to really go with a heavy duty kind of napalm chemical route. I've got some great examples here. A lot of pest control really comes with actual prevention and barriers. So as you can see, there's things like tanglefoot, where you can kind of put that around a tree so you can kind of separate usually things like ants and usually kind of sapsucker plants like whitefly or aphids or scale. They kind of work together. The plant to the next of it, that's yarrow. That's my ultimate favorite pest control plant. It's a great catch-all if you have a small garden. It attracts at least 5 or 6 different types of beneficial insects. The adults lay their eggs on these plants. It becomes a habitat plant for them, and then they raise their young on it, and then the flowers provide food for the adults, while the juveniles, like the example that we have on the top in the middle, that's a juvenile lady beetle. When you're looking at lady beetles and eating lots of the sap-sucking pests that we have, those are the ones who do the heavy lifting, hundreds and hundreds of say like aphids in a given day. Below that, you have a great resource. Those are called aphid mummies. So at one time they were aphids, but then a parasitic wasp, again, the yarrow was a great habitat plant for that, comes and they lay their eggs using the ovipositor in it. And it's kind of like the movie Alien. So when the parasitic wasps young are born, they're born within their food, and then they eat it, and then this is what's left behind. Another kind of barrier method is gophers. I know gophers are really taken off in the past few years. So kind of planting your plants in gopher baskets or lining any kind of raised beds that you may have with a gopher wire are going to help. They'll still be able to kind of chomp on the roots, but they're not going to be able to pull the plants down for that as well. And then for weed control, weeds and cracks, my personal favorite is to incorporate just regular white vinegar with Epsom salts. You're going to mix that together, and it works great for weeds and hardscapes, basically to avoid that kind of whole cycle where the weed's going to flower and then it's going to pass along seeds maybe on top of your mulch or something like that. Unlike typical salts, Epsom salts are magnesium. So actually it's one of those trace elements that exists very deeply in the soil. So it's not going to harm the soil. Actually, it's going to be a relative good benefit to that. Next. Told you to go by fast. Prevention is key. If you have an opportunity, I would definitely like to refer you to the UC Davis IPM website. They have these sheets where, depending on what kind of pest you're looking for, if you're looking to get rid of rats, if you're looking to get rid of aphids, if you're looking for any kind of new pests that are out there, they have all these really, really great fact sheets. And IPM is this great hierarchy of trying to control things with the first thing in IPM is actual prevention. Building up your healthy soil is going to help keep pests at bay. Planting plants that are going to attract beneficial insects are going to be at bay as well. These are a couple examples. If you have the space for it, there's Ceanothus, also known as California lilac. It's kind of like yarrow, where it's a really good host plant for a lot of beneficial insects as well as pollinators. And then there's a buckwheat is on the bottom as well. Also, there's a lot of solutions that can be found in your kitchen or your bathroom when it comes to pest control. Things like hydrogen peroxide, cinnamon, all different types of things that you may not even realize are great options that don't require a lot of pests. And also the thing with IPM is you're going to go through all these different kind of things in order to control the pest without toxins. But if you do need to use a toxin, you're going to want to make sure that you're using a toxin with the least amount of toxins in it. And so that'll do me. I think that's it, right? Just those 2 slides for me.
Yep.
That was a fast one.
Okay. And here's Sarah. Before we hand things over, I'll just go through our resources super quick. So Stop Waste website, we have our gardening website at stopwaste.org/gardening, and you'll see a picture on the left. All the different buttons there take you to all sorts of different resources that we have, including a gardening events calendar. So we post events from not only ourselves, but a ton of organizations across the Bay Area that do education, gardening education. We also have another part of our website is stopwaste.org/compost. If you were interested in worm composting or learning how to do backyard composting or, kind of flexing that muscle, we have a ton of resources on that as well. If you were interested in sheet mulching, which was that technique for layering cardboard, compost, and mulch to, suppress weeds and build soil, we have a website called lawntogarden.org that provides a ton of videos and resources on how to do sheet mulching. As well as we have a YouTube channel, the Stop Waste YouTube channel that has a bunch of videos on how to do all this. We also have a Facebook group, friends. If not everyone's on Facebook these days, but if you are, this is a Facebook group that is very driven by just folks that we've met through the years, and folks can ask questions, share pictures, and it's kind of a peer-to-peer place for folks to talk to each other about gardening. Lori's website for her business is a Facebook page, her Compost Gal Facebook. Yolanda's page is pollinatefarm.com if you want to connect with her and her resources and services. And then here again are those community resources that we had mentioned about the Compost Hubs, the different reuse sites, and a couple of other partners, including East Bay Mud and the Ecology Center. And that's it. I'll pass it over to Sarah. Thank you all very much.
Yay! Thank you all so much. This is an amazing wealth of information and local resources. I'm really excited to use some stuff myself. And then I know some residents that are experimenting with different things today that weren't able to join that will be excited too. And then Jenny, all the folks you mentioned that couldn't come today as well. So thank you. Thank you so much. We're going to be sending out the slides and a video either tomorrow or Monday. And then as you can see, Lori, Yolanda, and Trevor's contact information is here. My contact information will also be on the last slide. And then I'm going to have my colleague, Diana Sachs, just kind of close us up, introduce a little bit more about NCLT's sustainability work. And we'll take it from there.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you so much to Lori, Yolanda, and Trevor. I learned a whole bunch. My contact information is on that slide, but I'm also dropping it in the chat for everybody. I'm the Sustainability and Asset Manager at NCLT. And while we haven't really focused much on resources for gardening and waste reduction, we do a lot with energy efficiency, and we're currently trying to decarbonize our whole portfolio by 2030, removing all of the gas appliances and utilizing our electric appliances and renewable energy to keep utility prices low for everybody. So you can email me at diana.sachs@nclt.org if you have any questions. Also, if you have any questions about this presentation, I can probably, maybe if I can't answer your question, I can point you to the right person who can. So thank you very much, guys.